So, it's a situation that we've all found ourselves in. You have been a really good king. You have ruled the realm brilliantly. Frankly, the peasants couldn't have asked for a better king. Honestly, you've done so much for them. For example, you have occasionally touched some of them on the neck to cure their tuberculosis using the ancient and scientifically rigorous method known as the royal touch. Now, it didn't work. They all died, and that is unfortunate, but still, they should be grateful that you tried. Some people have complained that you've introduced some new taxes. Of course, you didn't want to, but the kingdom simply needed more castles, more banquets, a new throne to support your immense weight. Also, let's not forget that for the glory of England, you went to war with France. Everybody told you not to. They all said it would be a disaster. And it was, but let's not get caught up in the details. Overall, you have been a fantastic king. And that is why it's so disappointing and frankly upsetting that after all that you've done for them, the peasants are now revolting. Why exactly are they revolting? Who knows? Probably just the usual unreasonable demands like wanting to be able to leave their town without their landlord's permission. None of that really matters right now. The question for now is, what on earth are we going to do about this damned peasant rebellion? How are we going to stop the peasants from taking London and redecorating it with your internal organs? Now, the situation is pretty bad. There are about 50,000 peasants, and they've made it to the outskirts of London. They are really pretty angry. They've been burning and looting towns. They've been freeing prisoners and even executing judges. It is very much a heads on pikes type of situation. That said, we don't necessarily need to worry. That's because I'm about to give you a whole load of off-the-shelf strategies for dealing with the rebellion. These are tried and tested methods that have proven to be effective in the past. Now, whether or not you're going to be able to pull one of these strategies off will come down to your own competence. And let's be honest, your judgment can't be that good, otherwise you wouldn't have got yourself into this mess in the first place. That said, I am optimistic that with a bit of careful planning, we should be able to keep your head off a pike and your backside on the throne. So, without further ado, here are the strategies for you to consider. The first is an absolute classic. It's a real favorite of mine. It has been employed numerous times by a variety of different kings, and it has a very high success rate. Essentially, what you're going to do is you're going to tell the peasants that you will give them everything that they want. You are going to give in to all of their demands. That will make them incredibly happy. They will be overjoyed to know that they have a king that cares about them so deeply. Knowing that their concerns are in good hands, they will return home, all the while shouting, "Long live the king." Then you're going to be a man of your word, and you're going to make good on all the promises that you made to the peasants. No, obviously you're not going to do that. What you're going to do is, when the peasants are safely back in their homes, you are going to find the rebel leaders and kill them. Finally, you are going to declare all the promises that you made null and void. As you can see, it's a straightforward strategy. I think it has a kind of beauty to it. It's a joyous combination of deceit and violence. Now, historically, this strategy has been very effective. We have several examples of it working very well. The first is perhaps the most famous revolt in all of English history, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Now, just to get you up to speed on that, it was a revolt against Richard II, who was only 14 at the time. Now, the revolt started for several reasons. First, the Black Death had recently killed a huge amount of the population, and so the peasants had more bargaining power with their landlords. Essentially, they could demand higher wages. However, a law was passed which froze wages at the same level as they had been before the Black Death. The peasants viewed that as unfair because they knew that their labour was worth more than what they were getting paid. Another cause of the revolt was that people were angry because they were getting heavily taxed. In fact, in the years before the Peasants' Revolt, there were 3 poll taxes. Poll taxes were essentially taxes where everyone pays the same amount, irrespective of how rich or poor they are. Sounds fair to me, but for whatever reason, the poll taxes caused a lot of anger and resentment. In fact, it was actually the 3rd poll tax that sparked the rebellion. Royal officials went to Essex to collect the poll tax, but the villagers refused to pay. Then, when the tax collector tried to force them to pay, he was violently driven away by the peasants. Then, when news of that spread to the surrounding area, they also began attacking royal officials and refusing to pay taxes. Before long, thousands of rebels were marching towards London, demanding an end to serfdom and the abolition of the poll tax. Now, the situation got really pretty bad. The rebels managed to get inside London because some traitors opened the gates for them. It is no exaggeration to say that they pretty much controlled the whole city. Now, as you would imagine, with control of the city, they did some terrible peasant things. They managed to get their hands on the Chancellor, and they dragged him out into the street and beheaded him. They also burned the Savoy Palace, the beautiful residence of the Honourable John of Gaunt. He was one of the richest men in the country at the time. As you can see, the peasants were completely out of control, and to make matters worse, our boy Richard, His Majesty the King, he had hardly any troops in London at the time. So, what did Richard do? Well, he executed to perfection the strategy that I'm telling you about. He met the rebels just outside London at a place called Mile End, and he essentially said, "Yes, I'll give you everything that you want." He promised them an end to serfdom, freedom of movement, lower taxes, the whole shebang. Then, the next day, Richard met the rebels again, and at that meeting, we don't know exactly what happened, but basically some sort of commotion broke out. In fact, in the end, the leader of the rebels, Wat Tyler, was actually killed by one of the king's officials. Now, obviously, that could have led to absolute anarchy, and the rebels could very easily have killed King Richard. What saved him was the fact that he again promised to grant them everything that they wanted. Then, and this is the real masterstroke, he was actually able to get them out of London. He simply told them to follow him, and he led them out of the gates of London. As you can see, sometimes these rebels can be really pretty naive. With the rebels outside of London, King Richard was able to gather his forces to the point that the rebels were outnumbered and surrounded, and with their position suddenly much weaker, they decided to go home. As you can see, all that Richard had to do was say to the rebels that he would do what they wanted, and that was basically enough. Now, of course, Richard had no intention of actually keeping to his word, so as soon as the rebellion was over, he reneged on everything that he'd promised, and finally, he had many of the rebel leaders executed. So, that gives you an idea of how this strategy works. And as you can see, it can work very well. Another good example of it working well is the Pilgrimage of Grace. So just to get you up to speed on that, it was the largest rebellion against Henry VIII. It was essentially because of Henry's very famous split with the Pope in Rome. As I'm sure you know, Henry wanted to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, but the Pope refused to allow that. That led Henry to create his own church. In 1534, with the Act of Supremacy, Henry established the Church of England, with him as its head. Now, if that wasn't controversial enough, even more controversial was what we now call the dissolution of the monasteries. Essentially, Henry destroyed many Catholic monasteries in the country. They were closed down and they had their wealth seized by the crown and their land sold. Many of those ancient churches never recovered. As you would imagine, with Henry doing things that were that controversial, it wasn't long before a rebellion broke out, what we now call the Pilgrimage of Grace. Initially, the rebellion was pretty successful. The rebels were able to take the city of York. They called themselves a pilgrimage and they carried banners showing the 5 wounds of Christ. Essentially, they were trying to play up their religious motives, a cheap PR trick, I'm sure you'd agree. Their demands were as unreasonable as they always are. They wanted the restoration of the monasteries, the removal of some taxes, And most ridiculously of all, they wanted a parliament in the north. Can you believe it? Anyway, Henry responded with a textbook example of the strategy that I'm talking about. He sent the Duke of Norfolk to negotiate with the rebels and said that he would discuss their demands in Parliament. Cunningly, he said that if they went home, there wouldn't be any retribution. The naive rebels believed that, and they went home. Then, when the rebels were safely back in their homes, Henry sent his men to execute about 200 of them. Then, of course, Henry completely ignored all the rebels' demands and merrily continued destroying the Catholic monasteries. So again, as you can see, this strategy can work extremely well. It can give you everything that you want without having to fight a single battle. Now, I do need to make clear that this strategy can go wrong. I think one of the best examples of it going wrong is actually King John and the Magna Carta, one of the most famous episodes from all of English history. John tried to do exactly what I've been telling you about. He initially agreed to the rebels' demands. Then, when he thought it was safe to do so, he reneged and went back on his word. But unfortunately for John, it didn't work out nearly as well as it did in the cases that I've just mentioned. So I'll give you some background on the rebellion. It essentially started for the same reason that it always does, because John was an incredibly unpopular king, much like yourself, and that was for several reasons. The first was that he completely bungled a dispute with the Pope. Essentially, King John disagreed with the Pope about who was going to become the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Pope wanted one particular guy to become Archbishop, but John refused. That actually led the Pope to place England under interdict, which meant that all church services were suspended, and John himself was actually excommunicated. As you can see, it was a pretty dramatic move. Now, eventually, John did back down, and he agreed to pay tribute to the Pope. However, that ended up making him look weak, and so the nobles viewed it as a humiliation. Now, that was certainly not the only reason that John was so unpopular. In fact, perhaps the most important reason was because he lost a lot of England's holdings on the continent. You see, when John came to power, England had a lot of territory in what is now France. It was called the Angevin Empire. However, as soon as John came to power, he quickly set about losing a lot of that territory. Within 5 years of him being on the throne, he had lost Normandy. Now, that went down extremely badly with the English nobles, because many of them owned lands in France. Essentially, they had lost their continental estates. As you would imagine, John wanted to reconquer Normandy, but that required a huge amount of money, and so he had to raise taxes. Now, raising taxes was, of course, always unpopular in the medieval world, but John really pushed his luck even further than most kings would have. He actually used an incredibly controversial tax called scutage. Scutage basically meant that instead of the king demanding military service from the knights, he demanded money, and that caused a lot of resentment. Now, I should say that earlier kings had also used scutage, but the difference was that John really used it constantly. In fact, throughout his reign, he used it about 11 times, which was far more than his predecessors. Anyway, John used all that money to launch another campaign in France with the hope of retaking Normandy. Unfortunately for John, the campaign turned out to be a complete disaster, much like your own campaign in France. Now, as you would imagine, the nobles were not at all impressed. They had paid an enormous amount of money to fund the campaign, and it had completely failed. And so, the next year, 1215, they revolted against King John. They formally renounced loyalty to him, and they actually managed to get control of London. In fact, they didn't even have to fight for the city. The gates were actually open for them. The fall of London meant that many other nobles switched sides, and so all of a sudden, John found himself with a huge coalition of nobles against him. Anyway, John responded by trying to pull off the strategy that I've been telling you about. He met the nobles and he agreed to their demands. He accepted their charter, what has come to be known as the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta basically imposed new rules that would limit King John's power. He wasn't going to be able to abuse the scutage tax that I mentioned earlier. He wasn't going to be able to imprison people without a valid reason. John agreed to all of that, and so the rebellion disbanded. Then, John tried to launch into phase 2 of this strategy. He broke his word and went back on his promises. Now, he actually had quite a creative plan, which was to appeal to the Pope to declare the Magna Carta invalid. Now, as I mentioned before, John had actually fallen out with the Pope a few years earlier, but in the meantime, they had made up, and John had essentially turned England into something like a vassal state of the Pope. And because of that, the Pope now wanted to support John in his conflict with the barons. So anyway, the Pope, Innocent III, declared the Magna Carta null and void. He called it illegal and unjust, and he even went as far as excommunicating the barons. Now, all that might sound like a pretty decent plan, but it had one fatal flaw, which was that the barons were more than capable of forming another army and rebelling again. And that is exactly what they did. As soon as John reneged on the Magna Carta, the barons were able to very quickly gather another army and organize another rebellion. In fact, they actually had their own ace from the continent up their sleeves. That was Prince Louis of France, the man who would go on to become Louis VIII. The barons invited Louis to invade England and claim the throne. Now, I'm sure you would agree, but in terms of English history, that was a truly low move, absolutely below the belt. Anyway, John's position was now even worse than it had been before. It looked like he was going to lose the war, and although one doesn't like to think about it, England might even have ended up with a French king. So, how did John get out of that sticky situation? Well, basically, by dying of diarrhea. Now, I haven't included that as a potential strategy for you to consider in your current situation because I assume that's not the road you're looking to go down, but I guess theoretically that is another option available to you. Anyway, with John dead, the rebels decided that they didn't really want a French king, and so John's son Henry became king, Henry III. Overall, I would say that this whole strategy of agreeing and then reneging, it can work very well, but it can also go wrong. And so you do need to be aware of that. I would say whether or not you can use this strategy really depends on who you're up against. I think the reason that it did work in the Peasants' Revolt and the Pilgrimage of Grace is because those revolts were, for the most part, made up of commoners. They had very little power, very little organization. And that made it really difficult for them to reignite the rebellion once the king had gone back on his word. However, if you're facing nobles who do have enough power to raise another army, then it's very possible that as soon as you go back on your word, they will rebel again. And, you might end up with an even bigger problem on your hands than you had initially. Also, another problem with this strategy is that it relies on the rebels believing you when you say that you will do what they want. Essentially, the whole strategy relies on the rebels being so gullible, so naive, that they will trust you. Now, of course, there is no good reason that they wouldn't trust your majesty, other than the fact that you're lying, but let's put that aside. There's no good reason for them not to trust you, but it's still possible that they won't. And if that's the case, then just saying that you will do what they ask won't be enough to placate them. And so because of that, we do need to consider some other strategies. Now, the most simple and straightforward is to simply meet the rebels in battle. There are many examples of kings who have faced a rebellion, met the rebels in battle, and won, and that ended the rebellion. Now, one of the advantages of this strategy is that you end up looking really good, really strong. After the rebellion, everyone will be terrified of you. It's great. So let's have a look at a few examples of where this strategy has worked. One of the best is actually one of the lesser known rebellions that I'm going to be talking about, and that is the Cornish Rebellion of 1497. So what happened there was Henry VII was on the throne, and he wanted to fund a war against Scotland. And to fund the war, he needed to raise taxes. Tale as old as time. However, the incredibly disloyal people of Cornwall in the southwestern tip of England, they weren't up for paying the taxes. Basically, they felt that the war had nothing to do with them and they didn't want to pay for it. They rebelled against the crown, and before long, there were about 15,000 rebels marching towards London. The response of Henry VII was very simple. He met them in battle. the Battle of Deptford Bridge. The battle turned out to be very decisive, very one-sided, and about 1,000 rebels were killed. They simply weren't able to match the quality of the king's troops. That was partly because very few nobles had joined the rebellion, and so it was very weak in terms of military leadership. Anyway, after the battle, the rebel leaders were captured and executed. In fact, because they were traitors, they were hung, drawn, and quartered. As for the ordinary rebels, most of them just received fines rather than execution, and that was because Henry preferred to get as much money out of them as he could. Overall, I think you would agree that Henry VII handled the situation brilliantly, and it really shows us how well simply meeting a rebellion in battle can work. Now, of course, I do have to say, it's not always going to be that straightforward. If you are up against more competent, more battle-hardened rebels, then it will be much more difficult to defeat them in such a quick and decisive victory. It might be that the rebellion takes some real time and resources to put down. That is essentially what happened in the Glyndŵr Rebellion in Wales of the early 1400s. Essentially, the background to that is that England had conquered Wales about a century earlier under Edward I. Now, I have no idea why, but for whatever reason, the Welsh didn't like living under English rule. It might have been because the Welsh nobles had lost all their power, or that the Welsh people in general were treated as second-class citizens. It's difficult to understand, but for whatever reason, there was really quite a lot of resentment against English rule, and so Wales was primed for rebellion. Now, the trigger for the rebellion came in 1400 when a man named Owen Glyndŵr, a Welsh landowner, he had a legal dispute with an English lord, Reginald Grey. Now, we don't know exactly what happened, but potentially Grey used his connections with the English crown to get the courts to rule against Glyndŵr. Glyndŵr was so enraged by how he was treated that he launched a rebellion against the English king, Henry IV. Glyndŵr was declared Prince of Wales by his followers, and they quickly began trying to take territory. Anyway, the uprising was initially very successful. It spread all across Wales. Glyndŵr and his men were able to capture several castles and towns. Now the king, Henry IV, didn't negotiate, he didn't offer any concessions. His strategy was to simply send an army and meet the rebels in battle. Unfortunately, that didn't work at all. In fact, at the Battle of Bryn Glas of 1402, the English commander was captured by the rebels. Now, most worryingly of all, after his capture, the English commander actually switched sides and joined them. As you can see, there was treachery all around. Anyway, the situation got pretty bad. By 1404, so that's 4 years into the rebellion, Glyndŵr controlled a lot of Wales. Now, with all that power, he did some truly horrific things. He set up a Welsh parliament, he crowned himself Prince of Wales, and most appallingly of all, he actually allied with the French, who then sent him military support. Anyway, for a while, it actually looked like the rebellion might succeed. In the end, though, Henry IV, the English king, did just about manage to turn things around. In fact, he actually had an ace up his sleeve, which was his son, the man who would become Henry V. As I'm sure you know, Henry V was actually a bit of a genius on the battlefield, and so over the next few years, Prince Henry managed to subdue the rebellion. So, as you can see, simply meeting the rebels in battle isn't always a quick and easy solution, and I really need to emphasize that winning is far from guaranteed. There are several kings who have met rebellions in battle and lost the throne, and in some cases, their lives. Clearly, the most famous example of that is, of course, Charles I. Now, in this consultation, we don't have enough time to go into a lot of detail about that whole episode, but the initial rebellion started for two main reasons. The first was that King Charles I wasn't paying enough attention to Parliament. In fact, he actually ruled completely without Parliament for a full 11 years, what has come to be known as, quote-unquote, the personal rule. During that time, he raised money through some very unpopular taxes. Something else that people didn't like is that he tried to introduce religious reforms that many Protestants at the time believed were too close to Catholicism. People essentially thought that he was going to try to convert the country back to Catholicism. Anyway, Charles handled the whole situation extremely badly. Relations with Parliament became extremely tense, and in 1641, Parliament published a huge list of accusations against the king. Now, even up until that point, it wouldn't really have been that difficult for King Charles to come to some kind of agreement with the rebels. Essentially, he would have needed to involve Parliament more in decision-making and potentially not raise some of the taxes that he wanted to. Unfortunately for Charles, he was nowhere near politically adept enough to do that, and in 1642 he made a catastrophic error. Essentially, he was so unwilling to compromise that he tried to enter Parliament with soldiers to arrest some of the MPs who opposed him. Little did he know, those MPs had already escaped. As you imagine, doing that dramatically increased hostility between those that supported the king and those that were against him. Both sides quickly began raising armies, and essentially because of Charles's incompetence, England descended into civil war. Now, of course, Charles did try to defeat the rebels in battle, but he simply wasn't able to. The first major battle was the Battle of Edge Hill, and Charles wasn't able to win decisively. Over the next few years, there were a few more battles, and again, Charles didn't do particularly well. Then came the most important battle, the Battle of Naseby of 1645. That was extremely decisive, and the king's army was completely crushed. Eventually, in 1649, as I'm sure you all know, Charles I was tried and executed for treason. So, as you can see, trying to meet a rebellion in battle can go extremely wrong. It is very, very risky, and so if you can try to do some sort of negotiation, then that might be the better option. I certainly think it would have been for Charles. It was his stubbornness as much as his incompetence on the battlefield that ultimately ended up getting him killed. Another cautionary tale is the story of Richard III. Now, I need to give a bit of context about how Richard even got on the throne in the first place. Essentially, Richard III came to the throne as a result of the Wars of the Roses, which are a famously complicated set of civil wars. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that, but essentially what you need to know is that Richard's brother, Edward IV, was on the throne, and he had two sons. Because of that, it looked like the succession was going to be straightforward. King Edward had an heir and a spare, and so when he died, one of his sons would become king. However, Edward died very suddenly in 1483, and his eldest son was only 12 years old at the time, and that meant that he couldn't rule. Because of that, Edward's brother, Richard, became essentially regent. Now, long story short, Richard used what was supposed to be temporary power to make himself king. He declared Edward's children, his nephews, illegitimate, and he locked them up in the Tower of London. They then, mysteriously, disappeared. The whole episode has come to be known as The Princes in the Tower. Now, although we can't be sure of it, Richard almost certainly had his two nephews killed. Anyway, with them out of the way, Richard took the throne himself. Needless to say, Richard taking the throne in such a way was incredibly controversial, and so a lot of people thought that he wasn't a legitimate king. In fact, many people wanted a different guy to become king, Henry Tudor, the man who would go on to become Henry VII and found the Tudor dynasty. Now, Henry Tudor actually had quite a weak claim to the throne, but he managed to win the support of the nobles by promising to marry the daughter of Edward IV. That's Edward, who was the brother of Richard, who Richard betrayed by killing his sons. The idea was that with the claim of Henry Tudor and the claim of Edward IV's daughter combined, their children would have quite a good, strong claim to the throne, and that would then end the Wars of the Roses. And so, in August of 1485, Henry Tudor landed in Wales with a small army of French mercenaries, and he quickly managed to garner support. Many people in Wales supported him because his family had Welsh roots. Also, as I mentioned before, lots of the nobles didn't like Richard because they thought he was illegitimate. Now, I'm sure you'd agree that facing such a rebellion, Richard had basically no option but to fight. There was no negotiating to be done. The rebels wanted Richard to be replaced on the throne. In the end, he met the rebels at the Battle of Bosworth Field in Leicestershire, and unfortunately for Richard, he was killed on the battlefield. Henry Tudor then went on to become Henry VII and found the Tudor dynasty. Overall, this episode again shows us that meeting a rebellion in battle is always very risky. That said, sometimes you simply have no other option. I don't think that Richard did. Now, the strategies that we've talked about thus far do require quite a lot of courage, whether that is Richard II riding out of London to meet the peasants during the Peasants' Revolt, or Henry IV personally leading an army into battle during the Glyndŵr Rebellion. Unfortunately, I can see just from looking at you that you probably aren't going to be up to that. So let's talk about some of the less brave and bold options that you might want to consider. One strategy that isn't very obvious, but it can work well, is to simply wait and see and hope that the rebellion burns itself out on its own. The truth is that sometimes these rebellions do just lose momentum of their own accord. Now, clearly, this is something that you're going to have to judge extremely carefully, because if you do just wait and the situation gets worse, then you might end up in a worse position than you were in to start with. That said, if you do judge it right, this strategy can work, and we've got a couple of good examples of that. The first actually relates to Richard III, who I was just talking about. I explained a minute ago how Richard got the throne through some very shady means, and that meant that there was a lot of opposition to him. Now, what I didn't mention earlier is that before the rebellion that actually killed him, Richard did manage to see off a rebellion, what was called the Buckingham Rebellion. Essentially, because Richard was so unpopular, one of his former supporters turned on him, a man named Henry Stafford, the second Duke of Buckingham. Now, ironically, Buckingham had actually helped Richard seize power earlier in the year, but then, after a few months, he turned against him. We don't actually know why he did that, but for whatever reason, a few months after Richard took power, Buckingham began organising a rebellion against him. Buckingham's plan was that a series of uprisings would break out all across southern England, and at the same time, Henry Tudor, who I mentioned earlier, he was going to set sail to England and join the rebellion, and ultimately take the throne. Now, the plan wasn't necessarily a bad one, but unfortunately for Buckingham, almost everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Since it's England that we're talking about, his plans were ruined by what they always are, the weather. There were very heavy storms which flooded rivers in the west of England, and that prevented Buckingham from joining up with his supporters. Another issue was that while Henry Tudor did set sail to England, because the weather was so bad, he wasn't actually able to land, and so he had to return back to Brittany. Anyway, with the rebellion essentially falling apart, Buckingham was abandoned by his supporters. In the end, he was captured and executed. So, as you can see, in that episode, Richard III really didn't need to do very much. That is because the rebellion basically fell apart of its own accord. Now, another similar example is a rebellion called Wyatt's Rebellion, which was against Mary I of England, also called Bloody Mary. So for those that don't know, Mary was the daughter of Henry VIII, who of course turned England Protestant. Then, when Mary came to power, she restored Catholicism to England, and that was incredibly controversial. Perhaps even more controversial was that she wanted to marry Philip of Spain, heir to the Spanish throne. A lot of people really didn't like that because Spain was Catholic, and so it would really strongly entrench Catholicism in England. Also, people worried that it might make England something like a vassal of Spain. You have to understand that Spain was at the height of its power at the time, with an enormous amount of wealth coming in from its empire in the Americas. So anyway, people were not at all happy about Queen Mary marrying Philip of Spain, and so they decided to overthrow her and make England Protestant again. The rebellion began in 1554 when a man named Thomas Wyatt raised an army in Kent of about 3,000 men and marched towards London. Now, Mary responded not by offering concessions to the rebels, nor by meeting them in battle. She essentially just let them continue their march towards London. Now, I should say that she did try to shore up her support in the city. The main thing she did was to give a speech where she declared that she would remain queen and would resist the rebellion. Anyway, Wyatt and his army did make it to London, and their hope was that some of their supporters in the city would open the gates for them. Unfortunately for Wyatt, that didn't happen, and he was completely unable to get into London. With that, the whole rebellion pretty much collapsed. Wyatt was captured and executed for treason. As you can see, Mary really didn't need to do very much. Now, I should say that that was in part because the rebellion was quite small and they really didn't have much of a plan. Their plan was that someone would let them into London, and when that didn't happen, they didn't really have much of a plan B. Now, hopefully, you too will be just as lucky, and the rebellion that you're facing will turn out to be just as small and incompetent. That said, I wouldn't bet your favourite mistress on it. Anyway, I've got two more strategies for you to consider. The first is simple negotiation, even just giving the rebels what they want. Ultimately, there is no shame in just giving in. I mean, there is a lot of shame, and you will end up humiliated and weakened, but if it's the difference between that or ending up dead, it might be the best option. Now, we do have a good example of a king doing that, and that's Henry VII in the Yorkshire Rebellion of 1489. The rebellion started essentially because Henry wanted more money to support his ally, Anne of Brittany, who was threatened by the French king. He did manage to get a tax passed through Parliament to fund military action in Brittany. However, the people of Yorkshire, they weren't happy about paying the tax. They felt that they contributed enough to England by defending against the Scots, and so they should be exempt from having to finance a war in France. Anyway, Henry sent his tax collector, a man named Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, to Yorkshire to collect the taxes. But as soon as he got there, a violent rebellion broke out. The rebels actually attacked the tax collector's residence, and he was killed by the mob. Anyway, where a more stubborn king would have sent someone else to try to collect the taxes, Henry essentially backed down. He didn't try again to get the taxes out of the Yorkshiremen. He was worried that if he did, the whole of the north might break out in rebellion. Now, to try to save face, he did punish some of the rebel leaders, but he didn't impose any penalties on the wider population. Overall, he essentially let the rebels get their way. Now, obviously, that wasn't ideal because it meant that he had less money for his war in France. And it must be said, you kings do seem a little bit addicted to these wars in France. But, sometimes you just have to pick your battles. Now, I've got one final option available to you, and this is something you really only want to consider if you have absolutely no negotiating position left. And that is to flee to France. Now, I should say, going to France does have some advantages. The weather is better, the food's better, they've got lots of great cheeses. Something to be said for it. That said, all of that comes at the cost of losing the throne and absolutely all of your dignity. Now, the most famous king who chose this option was James II when he lost power in what is known as the Glorious Revolution. James was unpopular because he was Catholic, and many people feared that he wanted to impose Catholicism on England. He put Catholics in powerful positions, and he He ruled in quite an authoritarian way. Anyway, the trigger for the Glorious Revolution was James having a son. Essentially, that son would very likely entrench a Catholic dynasty in England indefinitely. That was intolerable to the nobles, and so they invited James's daughter, Mary, and her husband, William of Orange, to invade England and take the throne. William and Mary promised that they would keep England Protestant. In November of 1688, William of Orange landed in England, and many English nobles and soldiers switched sides to support him. Now, James really didn't have many options available to him. People were deserting him en masse. On paper, he did have a larger army than William, but many of his officers were Protestant, so they weren't particularly loyal to him. Pretty quickly, it became clear that James couldn't rely on his army, his political allies, or even his own family. In the end, rather than go down in a blaze of Catholic glory, James opted for the more comfortable option. He fled to France. In fact, he was actually captured on his way to France and then brought back to London and then allowed to escape again. And the second time, he did manage to make it to France. He was allowed to escape because the soon-to-be new King of England, William, thought that executing or imprisoning him would make him look like a martyr, whereas allowing him to flee made him look like he'd abandoned the throne. As you can see, it was an incredibly undignified end to James's reign, and so you need to think about whether you really want that to be your legacy. On the plus side, James's years in France were very comfortable. He was welcomed by the French king, Louis XIV, and he was given a very luxurious residence near Paris. There he had a whole court in exile, and he was able to pretend to himself that he was still the rightful King of England. Overall, this option clearly needs to be an absolute last resort. I mean, who would want to abandon England to live a life of extreme luxury in France with absolutely no responsibilities and all the food you can eat and mistresses galore? Anyway, that concludes my list of potential strategies for how to deal with the rebellion against you. Hopefully, it's given you some food for thought. One final thing I'd like to say is that, you really do need to sort this out, because a lot of English kings have met some very gruesome ends because they mishandled rebellions. A good example is, of course, Charles I, who I mentioned earlier. Charles was actually beheaded outside Banqueting House in London in front of a huge crowd. Really not a particularly dignified way to go. I also mentioned John earlier, who died of diarrhea while fighting the rebels. I would assume that's not how you want to be remembered, with the shits. To be honest, I think probably the worst thing that's happened to an English king is what happened to Edward II. Now, I've not talked about Edward II yet, but his story is a very good cautionary tale for just how unpleasant things can get. Now, Edward was unpopular for several reasons. First, he had a few court favourites that had a huge amount of power, but they were absolutely hated by the nobles, and that caused a lot of resentment. Something else was that he suffered a terrible defeat in Scotland, the Battle of Bannockburn. That defeat pretty much secured Scotland's independence from England. Anyway, eventually, because Edward was so unpopular, his own wife actually deposed him. He ended up imprisoned, but the truly gruesome thing is how he potentially died. Supposedly, Edward's handlers wanted to kill him, but they didn't want to leave any external marks. Their solution was to heat up an iron rod until it was red hot and thrust it somewhere well beyond the bounds of royal dignity. Now, we don't know if that story is true. There is a very good chance that it's not true, but I do hope that it gives you some impetus to take your situation incredibly seriously. Ultimately, both you and I do wish to see your sphincter remain uncharred.